When Michelle Harris goes undercover as a choir director in a small town to investigate missing funds, she expects resistance, but not the silent, simmering prejudice she encounters. As she uncovers the financial misdeeds, she begins to realize that corruption isn't the only thing festering in this community. Will Michelle expose the truth in time, or will the town's secrets remain hidden, tearing apart everything it claims to stand for? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now let's dive in. Michelle Harris sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary as she stared at the community center ahead. It was a large, somewhat tired-looking building, its bricks worn with age, but still boasting the kind of charm that made it a hub for the small town. A place of laughter, shared stories, and local activities. For most people, walking into a building like this wouldn't be nerve-wracking, but for Michelle, this was more than just another job. Today marked the beginning of a new role for her. A role she had never anticipated playing. Undercover work was her specialty, but posing as a choir director in a predominantly white town was a different challenge. The locals didn't know it, but Michelle had been assigned here to investigate allegations of financial mismanagement. Large sums of money had gone missing from the community center's budget, funds that were supposed to benefit the town's youth and elderly programs. For Michelle, this was another case of the powerful taking advantage of the powerless. She took a deep breath, brushing back a stray curl and checking her appearance in the rearview mirror. Her caramel brown eyes reflected back a mixture of determination and wariness. The small town was a far cry from the cities she had worked in, but the tension she sensed was all too familiar. Stepping into a community where she didn't blend in, where she'd be judged not just for her role but also for her race, was something Michelle had dealt with her entire life. It was time. Stepping out of the car, she pulled her coat tighter against the cold autumn wind, making her way toward the center's entrance. As soon as she walked in, the air shifted. The community center's welcoming signs and brightly colored murals gave off an air of inclusion, but Michelle could feel the curious and skeptical eyes on her immediately. "Hi there, you must be Michelle Harris." A crisp voice broke through her thoughts. A woman with short, meticulously styled hair approached her, wearing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She held a clipboard in one hand, which she adjusted nervously. "Yes, that's me," Michelle replied, forcing a smile. "You must be Susan, the manager." "That's right," Susan replied, extending her hand for a quick, almost formal handshake. "We're so glad to have you here. I understand you'll be leading our choir program." Michelle caught the flicker of hesitation in Susan's tone, an almost imperceptible change that people like her were trained to notice. It wasn't outright hostility, but it was the subtle undercurrent of doubt. People here hadn't expected someone like Michelle to step into the role of a choir director, especially not a black woman from out of town. "Yes, I'm really looking forward to getting started," Michelle said, her tone friendly but professional. Susan nodded, but there was still something guarded in her demeanor. "I'll show you around. We've had a lot of changes lately, but I think you'll settle in just fine." As Susan led her through the community center, Michelle observed everything carefully. The place was a maze of hallways and rooms, each one bustling with different activities. Elderly residents played cards in one room, children ran through another, and the smell of fresh-baked goods wafted from the small kitchen. It was all a facade of normalcy, but Michelle knew better. Beneath this idyllic setting was a deeper issue. Money was disappearing, and people were taking advantage of the very community they claimed to serve. When they arrived at the choir room, Susan gestured toward a piano at the far end. "This is where you'll be working with the choir. We've got a good group, though it's been tough getting everyone back in sync after the last director left. You'll have your work cut out for you." Michelle nodded, but her mind was already racing. This job was about more than just leading a choir. She had to gain the trust of the staff, integrate herself into the fabric of the community, all while quietly digging into the financial records. It wouldn't be easy, especially when some people here didn't want her to succeed. As they finished the tour, Susan led her to a small office at the back of the center. "This will be your space," she said, opening the door to reveal a modest room with a desk, a chair, and a few shelves. "I'll leave you to get settled." "Thank you," Michelle replied, walking into the room. As Susan left, Michelle sat down at the desk and took a deep breath. The journey ahead would be a challenging one. She could already sense the resistance, the quiet prejudice that lived in the undercurrents of every interaction. But Michelle wasn't here to make friends. She was here for the truth. Pulling out her laptop, she opened the file that detailed the center's finances. The discrepancies were glaring, but nothing was certain yet. She'd have to tread carefully, observe everything and everyone. Her phone buzzed. A message from her supervisor back at headquarters. "Keep your head down. Don't rush this. Trust is key." Michelle smiled faintly. She'd learned long ago that trust was hard-won and easily lost. In this town, it would take more than just a few friendly rehearsals to break through the walls people had built. But if there was one thing she excelled at, it was breaking barriers, whether they were made of lies or of prejudice. The choir would be her entry point. She didn't know if the group would accept her or push her away, but either way, they were part of her mission. She closed the laptop and leaned back, staring out the small window behind her desk. Outside, the late afternoon sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the quiet streets. This town didn't know what was coming, but neither did Michelle. The journey ahead would be one of not just exposing corruption, but facing the uncomfortable truths about prejudice, community, and the resilience needed to fight against both. Michelle's first week at the community center passed in a blur of choir rehearsals, awkward introductions, and subtle tensions that buzzed just below the surface. As much as she tried to focus on her job, the undercurrents of resistance were hard to ignore. It wasn't outright hostility, but there was something unspoken, an unwelcoming stiffness in some of her coworkers' eyes, a hesitation that hung in the air whenever she entered a room. Her biggest challenge, though, wasn't just the choir or the staff. It was Jonathan. Jonathan, the financial officer, had been working at the center for years and was deeply entrenched in its operations. He was well-liked, respected, and had the kind of small-town authority that made people listen when he spoke. But from the moment Michelle arrived, he had been distant, if not outright dismissive. Their interactions had been brief but telling. Whenever she tried to bring up her concerns about the financial records, Jonathan would shut her down with a polite but firm, "I've got it under control," as if to imply that Michelle's input wasn't necessary. It was frustrating, especially because Jonathan was likely the key to uncovering what was really going on with the missing funds. One afternoon, Michelle found herself in the hallway, just outside Jonathan's office. She knocked, her knuckles rapping lightly on the wooden door, hoping this time he'd be more open to a conversation. "Come in," Jonathan's voice called from inside. Michelle entered, finding Jonathan seated behind his desk, his brow furrowed as he reviewed a spreadsheet on his computer. He glanced up briefly, offering a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Jonathan," Michelle began, keeping her tone professional, "I was hoping we could go over the financials together. I've been reviewing the youth program's budget, and there are some discrepancies I'd like to understand better." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. His expression remained neutral, but there was a guardedness in his posture, a quiet defensiveness that Michelle had come to expect in situations like this. "There's nothing to worry about," Jonathan said, his voice calm but dismissive. "Everything's accounted for. You don't need to get involved in the finances. It's my department." Michelle resisted the urge to sigh. She had anticipated resistance, but Jonathan's attitude was more than just professional turf guarding. It felt personal, though he would never admit that out loud. "I understand that," Michelle replied, keeping her voice even, "but as part of my role, I want to make sure everything is running smoothly, especially since the choir budget falls under youth programs. It's important that we're both on the same page." Jonathan's jaw tightened slightly, a barely noticeable twitch that gave away his discomfort. "I've been handling the finances here for over a decade. I think I know what I'm doing." Michelle studied him for a moment. Jonathan was the kind of man who prided himself on his work, who believed that experience alone gave him authority. But she had seen this before. people who were so deeply embedded in their roles that they resisted any scrutiny, whether it was deserved or not. "I'm sure you do," Michelle said, keeping her tone respectful but firm. "But I'd still like to take a closer look, just to make sure we're maximizing the resources for the programs." Jonathan's eyes flicked away, focusing on a stack of papers on his desk. "Like I said, it's all under control." The conversation was clearly over. Jonathan had made it clear that he wasn't interested in collaborating, at least not with her. But Michelle wasn't deterred. She knew from experience that resistance like this often meant there was something to uncover, and she was going to find it, with or without Jonathan's help. As Michelle left his office, her mind was already racing through the possibilities. Jonathan's defensiveness could mean he was hiding something, or it could simply be a matter of pride. But either way, she couldn't afford to let her guard down. Later that evening, Michelle sat at her small desk in her office, going over the financial documents once again. The discrepancies were small but consistent, minor amounts missing from the youth program's budget, irregular transfers that didn't add up. It wasn't enough to raise alarms for most people, but Michelle had seen patterns like this before. Someone was siphoning off funds, slowly enough to avoid detection, but steadily enough to cause damage. She glanced at the clock. It was almost time for choir practice. Walking into the rehearsal room, Michelle was greeted by a mix of warm smiles and hesitant nods from the choir members. The group was diverse in terms of age and background, but there was still a sense of unease, especially among the older members. They weren't used to someone like her leading them, a woman who wasn't from their town, and who didn't fit the mold of what they expected. One of the younger members, Rosa, stood off to the side, fidgeting with her music sheet. Rosa was a shy, quiet young woman in her early 20s, one of the few people of color in the choir. Michelle had noticed how she tended to stay on the outskirts during rehearsals, almost as if she didn't want to be noticed. As the choir practiced, Michelle could see Rosa struggling with a particularly difficult section. Her voice faltered, and she glanced nervously at the other choir members, who didn't seem to notice her discomfort. After the rehearsal, as the choir members began to file out, Michelle approached Rosa. "Hey Rosa, can I talk to you for a minute?" Rosa looked startled but nodded, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "I noticed you were having a little trouble with that last section," Michelle said gently. "I just wanted to check in and see how you're feeling about the music. You're doing great, by the way." Rosa hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I'm cut out for this. Everyone else seems to have it all together, and I feel like I don't belong." Michelle's heart ached at the words. She had seen that same uncertainty in herself at times, feeling like an outsider, like she had to work twice as hard just to prove she deserved to be there. "You belong here just as much as anyone else," Michelle said firmly. "Don't doubt that. You've got a beautiful voice, and I can tell you're passionate about the music. That's what matters." Rosa gave a small, hesitant smile, but it was clear she still had her doubts. Michelle knew that feeling well. The feeling of being on the outside, of questioning whether you truly had a place in a space that didn't seem to welcome you. But Michelle wasn't just here to investigate the finances or lead the choir. She was here to build trust, to bridge the gaps that divided this town, whether they were rooted in prejudice, fear, or misunderstanding. As she watched Rosa leave the room, Michelle made a silent promise to herself. She would uncover the truth, but she would also work to change the culture in this community. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but she had faced worse challenges before. And in this town, as in life, change would come, one step at a time. As the days passed, Michelle's work at the community center deepened. She had settled into the routine of leading choir rehearsals, but her real mission, uncovering the financial misappropriations, was always at the forefront of her mind. Every interaction, every glance at the center's records brought her closer to the truth, but it wasn't happening fast enough. She was being stonewalled, and the more she pushed, the more resistance she felt, particularly from Jonathan. Jonathan's reluctance to work with her was growing more transparent. While he maintained a polite facade, there was no denying the coldness that colored their interactions. The subtle prejudice that Michelle had sensed from him at the beginning had become more pronounced, though he was careful never to let it slip into overt hostility. It was in the way he dismissed her concerns, in the way he always seemed to have other things to do when she tried to collaborate. One afternoon, Michelle decided to confront him head-on. She knocked on his office door and stepped inside, determined to get some answers. "Jonathan, we need to talk about the budget," she said, her tone more direct than it had been in the past. Jonathan looked up from his desk, surprise flashing in his eyes for a brief moment before he composed himself. "I thought we'd already gone over this," he replied, his voice measured. "We haven't," Michelle said, walking over to the chair opposite his desk and sitting down. "I've been reviewing the youth program's finances, and there are too many inconsistencies for me to ignore. You keep telling me everything is under control, but that's not what I'm seeing. Where is the money going, Jonathan?" Jonathan's jaw tightened, a flicker of something darker passing across his face before he quickly hid it. "Like I've said before, it's all accounted for. I don't know what you think you're seeing, but there's no reason to keep questioning my work." Michelle didn't back down. "I'm not questioning your work. I'm questioning the numbers. There's money missing, and I don't believe it's an oversight." For a moment there was silence. Jonathan's expression remained stoic, but there was a tension in the air that Michelle couldn't ignore. She could feel the wall between them growing thicker, harder to break through. He wasn't going to admit anything, at least not yet. "I don't appreciate what you're implying," Jonathan finally said, his voice dangerously calm. "I've dedicated years to this center, and I don't have to explain myself to someone who's been here for 5 minutes. Michelle's heart pounded, but she didn't let his words shake her. "I'm not here to question your dedication, Jonathan. I'm here to make sure the money is being used for what it's supposed to be used for. Programs that help this community. The kids, the elderly, everyone who depends on these services." Jonathan's eyes flicked down to the papers on his desk, and for a moment, Michelle thought she saw a flash of guilt. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "There's nothing more to discuss," he said, his voice tight. "If you have an issue, you can take it up with the board." Michelle knew she was hitting a wall with him, at least for now. But the conversation wasn't over. She rose from her seat, her eyes locked on his. "I will take it up with the board if I have to," she said, her voice low but firm. "But before I do, I'd like to give you the chance to explain what's really going on." Jonathan didn't respond. His silence was all the answer she needed for now. She walked out of the office, her mind already racing with the next steps she needed to take. The board wasn't going to be any easier to deal with, but if Jonathan was involved in something, she needed to know how deep it went. And she had a feeling that he wasn't the only one hiding things. That evening, Michelle stayed late at the center, going through more financial records. The more she dug, the clearer the picture became. Small amounts of money had been diverted from various programs over the past few years, always just enough to avoid raising suspicion. But when added up, it was a significant loss. It wasn't just incompetence. This was deliberate. As she worked, Michelle heard a soft knock on her office door. She looked up to see Rosa standing in the doorway, her expression uncertain. "Hey," Michelle said, smiling warmly. "What's up? Everything okay?" Rosa stepped inside, clutching her music folder to her chest. "I just wanted to talk for a minute, about choir, and other things." Michelle gestured for her to sit down. "Sure, let's talk. What's on your mind?" Rosa hesitated, glancing down at the floor before she spoke. "I've been feeling, I don't know, like I don't really fit in here. I mean, with the choir and, well, in general." Michelle's heart went out to Rosa. She had seen the same uncertainty in Rosa's eyes during every rehearsal, the way she held back, unsure of herself, unsure of her place. Michelle knew that feeling all too well. "You're not alone in feeling that way," Michelle said softly. "I think a lot of people in this town feel that way, even if they don't admit it. But you do belong here, Rosa. You have a beautiful voice, and you bring something special to the choir." Rosa looked up, her eyes bright with emotion. I feel like I'm always on the outside, like I'm different, and people don't really see me. Or they see me, but not in the way I want them to." Michelle nodded, understanding exactly what Rosa meant. "I know that feeling, and it's hard. But the truth is, sometimes we have to be the ones to show people who we really are. Not everyone's going to get it right away, but that doesn't mean you don't belong. Rosa smiled faintly, her shoulders relaxing a little. Thanks, Michelle. I guess I just needed to hear that. You're always welcome to talk to me, anytime, Michelle said, meaning it. And if you ever need extra help with the music, just let me know. Rosa nodded, standing up to leave. But just as she reached the door, she paused, looking back at Michelle. I've been hearing things, she said quietly, about the center, about the money. Michelle's pulse quickened. What kind of things? Rosa hesitated again, glancing over her shoulder as if someone might be listening. I don't know all the details, but people talk. They say things have been going missing for a while, that not everything's on the up and up. I don't know if it's true, but... Michelle's mind raced. This was the first time someone else had acknowledged the financial discrepancies, even if it was just through whispers. Thanks for telling me, she said, her voice calm but encouraging. If you hear anything else, or if you ever want to talk about it, you know where to find me. Rosa nodded, then slipped out of the office, leaving Michelle alone with her thoughts. The cracks were starting to show. People were beginning to notice, and that meant it was only a matter of time before the whole truth came out. Michelle had to tread carefully, but she knew she was getting closer. And as she stared down at the financial records spread out on her desk, she couldn't shake the feeling that Jonathan was hiding more than just numbers. The day had come. After weeks of digging, after countless rehearsals and tense exchanges, Michelle finally had enough evidence to confront the board about the financial discrepancies. The community center board was made up of a small group of influential townspeople, and she knew getting them to listen wouldn't be easy. These were people who had known Jonathan for years, who trusted him implicitly. Bringing up the fact that funds were missing, and that Jonathan might be involved, was going to shake the very foundations of the trust they had built. But Michelle couldn't wait any longer. The discrepancies were too clear to ignore, and she was tired of being brushed aside. The meeting was held in the community center's largest conference room, a spacious area that felt too formal for the kind of casual interactions Michelle had seen elsewhere in the building. It was cold and sterile, with a long table dominating the center, flanked by high-backed chairs. As Michelle sat down, she could feel the tension building in her stomach, but she pushed it aside. This wasn't the time for second-guessing. Susan was there, of course, along with several other members of the board. Jonathan was seated near the head of the table, his expression unreadable. He hadn't spoken to Michelle since their last tense conversation in his office, and she had a feeling that he knew what was coming. "Thank you all for coming," Michelle began, her voice steady even as her heart raced. "I've been reviewing the financial records for the community center over the past few weeks, and I've found some concerning discrepancies. I believe it's important that we address these issues immediately." There was a moment of silence. The board members exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from confusion to concern. Jonathan, however, remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on Michelle, but revealing nothing. "Discrepancies?" One of the board members, a woman named Linda, asked, her brow furrowed. "What kind of discrepancies are we talking about?" Michelle took a deep breath and opened the file she had brought with her, laying out the documents on the table for everyone to see. Over the past 3 years, funds allocated for youth programs, senior services, and other essential activities have been diverted. Small amounts at first, but it adds up. We're talking about thousands of dollars that should have gone to these programs, but it's gone elsewhere. The room fell into a tense silence. The board members leaned in, examining the documents with growing unease. Michelle could see the realization beginning to dawn on their faces. This wasn't just a minor accounting error. This was something much bigger. "I've been looking into this since I started here," Michelle continued, "and I believe we need to take immediate action to find out where this money has gone." Jonathan finally spoke, his voice calm but with an edge of defensiveness. "Are you accusing me of something, Michelle?" The room went still. All eyes turned to Jonathan, and Michelle could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She knew this was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. "I'm not accusing anyone," Michelle said, choosing her words carefully. But as the financial officer, you're the one who has access to the records. I've tried to address these concerns with you directly, but I haven't received any clear answers. I think it's only fair that we look into this together, transparently, to make sure everything is accounted for. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest. I've been handling the finances for this center for over a decade. I think I know what I'm doing. And yet, Michelle countered, the numbers don't add up. This isn't a personal attack, Jonathan. It's about doing what's right for the community. Jonathan's eyes flashed with something Michelle hadn't seen before. Anger. But it was quickly replaced by a mask of indifference. If you're so concerned about the finances, maybe you should take it up with the auditor, he said coolly. But I assure you, there's nothing here that hasn't been approved by the board. The tension in the room was palpable. The board members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, clearly unsure of what to make of the situation. On one hand, they trusted Jonathan. On the other, the evidence Michelle had presented was hard to ignore. Susan, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. Jonathan, we've all trusted you with the finances for years, but I think Michelle has raised some valid concerns. We should at least look into this. If there's nothing wrong, then it will only clear the air. Jonathan's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Michelle thought he might refuse outright. But then, to her surprise, he nodded, though his expression remained cold. Fine. If that's what the board wants, I have nothing to hide. The room exhaled collectively, as though everyone had been holding their breath, waiting for the confrontation to escalate further. Michelle could sense that the board members were relieved that Jonathan hadn't outright rejected the idea of an audit, but she wasn't sure if that was because they trusted him or because they didn't want to believe something more sinister was at play. After the meeting, as the board members slowly filed out, Michelle remained in the conference room, packing up her documents. She felt a mix of relief and frustration. She had taken the first step, but it hadn't gone the way she'd hoped. Jonathan's calm acceptance of the audit felt more like a calculated move than genuine cooperation. Something wasn't right, and Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that he was still hiding something. As she packed up, she noticed Jonathan lingering near the doorway, his eyes fixed on her. There was no one else in the room now, and the air between them was heavy with unresolved tension. Do you really think you can come in here and change everything? Jonathan asked, his voice low and controlled. Michelle straightened up, meeting his gaze. It's not about changing everything, Jonathan. It's about making sure things are done right. This community deserves that. Jonathan's lips pressed into a thin line. You don't know this town. You don't know the people here. You think you can just waltz in and start pointing fingers? Michelle felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her voice calm. I'm not here to make enemies. I'm here to help. And if that means asking tough questions, then that's what I'll do. This isn't personal, Jonathan. It's about the truth. Jonathan stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head. You don't get it, do you? People like you always come in thinking you know better. The words hung in the air, and Michelle felt the familiar sting of his meaning. People like her. He didn't have to say it outright. His prejudice was clear. I'm not going to let this go, Michelle said quietly. And neither should you. Jonathan didn't respond. He simply turned and walked out of the room, leaving Michelle standing there, alone with her thoughts. The confrontation had only scratched the surface. She knew the audit might reveal more, but she also knew that some battles were fought not just in numbers but in hearts and minds. As she walked out of the community center that evening, Michelle felt the weight of the day pressing down on her. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the quiet streets. She had done what she could. But there was still so much work to be done, not just in exposing the truth, but in addressing the deeper issues of prejudice and division that ran through this town. She thought about Rosa, about the quiet struggle the young woman had shared with her. Michelle knew that Rosa's feelings of isolation weren't unique. There were others in this town who felt the same. The missing funds were just one part of a much larger problem. This town had cracks in its foundation. Cracks that went beyond money and resources. And as Michelle stood there, watching the last light of the day fade, she realized that her role here wasn't just to solve a financial mystery. It was to bring these cracks to the surface, to confront the biases and fears that had been left unchecked for too long. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The silence that had allowed these issues to fester was finally breaking, and there was no turning back now. The day of the audit arrived with a sense of unease hanging over the community center. Whispers filled the halls as people speculated about what would be uncovered, and there was a quiet but palpable tension in the air. Michelle had spent the past few days bracing herself, not just for the results of the audit, but for what it would mean for the town. No matter what the findings, this community was about to face some hard truths that had been ignored or glossed over for far too long. As she arrived at the center that morning, she noticed a few of the choir members lingering near the entrance, exchanging anxious glances. Rosa was among them, standing with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. When she saw Michelle, she gave a small tentative wave. "Hey, Rosa," Michelle said, walking over. "Everything okay?" Rosa shrugged, her eyes darting toward the center's doors. "I don't know. People are talking. A lot of them are nervous about what's going to happen with the audit." Michelle nodded. "I figured as much. Change always makes people nervous, especially when it's been a long time coming." Rosa hesitated, then looked Michelle in the eye. "Do you think it'll really make a difference? I mean, the audit and everything. People here, they don't like to talk about stuff like this." Michelle knew what Rosa meant. The town had been resistant to change, clinging to the familiar, even as cracks had begun to show in its foundations. The financial discrepancies were just one symptom of a deeper problem, a reluctance to confront the biases and prejudices that had quietly shaped the community for years. "I think it can," Michelle said softly. "But it's not going to be easy. This audit is just the beginning. The real change has to come from people. People like you, like me, like everyone who's been watching from the sidelines. We have to keep pushing for it." Rosa looked down, nodding slowly. "I hope you're right." Before Michelle could say more, the doors to the center opened, and a group of people entered, including the auditors. The board members were already inside, along with Jonathan, whose expression remained as guarded as ever. It was clear that he was preparing for a fight, though he kept his demeanor calm and professional. As the auditors began their work, Michelle went about her day, leading the choir in a rehearsal that felt heavy with anticipation. The music was beautiful, but there was a strain in the air, an undercurrent of tension that even the harmonies couldn't quite smooth over. She could feel the weight of everything pressing down on the choir members, on herself. After rehearsal, Michelle found herself pacing in her office, trying to focus on anything other than the ticking clock. The audit would take time, but the waiting was agonizing. She knew she had done everything she could to bring attention to the issue, but what came next was out of her hands. Hours later, just as the sun began to sink behind the horizon, the audit concluded. The results were presented to the board, and Michelle was called in to hear the findings. The atmosphere in the room was tense. The board members seated around the long table, their expressions serious. Jonathan sat with his arms crossed, his face unreadable, though Michelle could see the flicker of worry in his eyes. The lead auditor, a middle-aged man with graying hair, stood at the front of the room, his expression solemn. "After reviewing the financial records of the community center over the past 3 years, we have identified significant discrepancies in the allocation of funds. Money meant for youth programs and other services was indeed diverted, and we have traced these discrepancies back to multiple sources." Michelle's heart raced. This was it. The truth was finally coming to light. The auditor continued, "While we found that several individuals were involved in mismanaging these funds, the primary responsibility appears to lie with the financial officer, Mr. Jonathan Parker." A shocked murmur rippled through the room. The board members looked at Jonathan in disbelief, while Jonathan sat in stony silence, his jaw clenched. "We also found that there were systemic issues with oversight and transparency within the center's financial practices," the auditor added. "These problems allowed the mismanagement to go undetected for so long. I recommend immediate changes to the center's financial policies and procedures to prevent this from happening in the future." The room was quiet, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Jonathan didn't speak, didn't defend himself. He simply stared ahead, his expression one of resignation. Michelle felt a mix of emotions, relief that the truth had been uncovered, but also a deep sadness. Jonathan wasn't just a corrupt official. He was a product of a system that had failed to hold people accountable, a system that allowed prejudice and complacency to fester. He had made mistakes, serious ones, but those mistakes were part of a much larger problem. The board members, clearly shaken by the findings, began discussing the next steps, removing Jonathan from his position, implementing stricter financial controls, and making sure the center's programs were properly funded moving forward. It was a victory, in a way, but it didn't feel triumphant. The following weeks brought changes to the community center. Jonathan resigned quietly, his departure leaving a hole in the leadership that the board scrambled to fill. The town was buzzing with rumors, and while some people were relieved to see accountability finally enforced, others were angry, defensive, unwilling to face the reality that their community had been complicit in allowing the mismanagement to continue for so long. But there were also signs of hope. The youth programs that had been neglected were slowly being revived, with new funding and a renewed focus on inclusivity and transparency. Michelle saw more people stepping forward, asking questions, wanting to be involved in making the center a better place. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was a start. One of the most significant changes came from the choir. Under Michelle's leadership, the choir had become more than just a group of people singing together. It had become a symbol of the town's potential for unity. People from all backgrounds, young and old, had come together to create something beautiful, something that transcended the divisions that had once kept them apart. The day of the choir's big performance arrived, a special event to celebrate the community center's revival. The auditorium was packed with townspeople, all eager to see what the choir had been working on for months. The lights dimmed, and Michelle stood at the front of the stage, her heart swelling with pride as she looked out at the audience. As the choir began to sing, the harmonies filled the room, a powerful reminder of what could happen when people came together. Rosa's voice soared above the rest, confident and strong, and Michelle couldn't help but smile. This was what she had been working for. Not just the audit, not just the investigation, but the chance to help people find their voices, to help them heal. The performance was a success, and when it was over, the applause was thunderous. But more than that, there was a feeling in the air that something had shifted, something important. After the performance, as people milled around, congratulating the choir members and talking excitedly about the future of the center, Jonathan approached Michelle quietly. His face was weary, and there was a humility in his expression that hadn't been there before. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "I messed up. I let a lot of people down." Michelle looked at him, feeling a pang of sympathy. "It's never too late to make things right," she said softly, "but you have to be willing to change." Jonathan nodded, and though he didn't say anything more, there was something in his eyes that told Michelle he understood. It wouldn't be easy, but perhaps this was the beginning of a new chapter for him as well. As the evening wound down and the crowd began to disperse, Michelle stood outside the community center, watching as people laughed and talked, the warmth of the night wrapping around them. The journey had been long and difficult, but standing there, she felt a sense of peace. This town had its scars from prejudice, from mistakes, from years of looking the other way. But it also had the potential to heal. And as Michelle watched Rosa laughing with her friends, the glow of the streetlights casting soft shadows around them, she knew that healing was possible. Change wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight. But it could happen if people were willing to confront the past and work toward a better future. And in that moment, Michelle believed that this town, with all its flaws, was ready for that future. As she walked toward her car, the sounds of the town fading behind her, Michelle felt a quiet satisfaction settle in her chest. She had come here to uncover the truth. But what she had found was something even more powerful, the possibility of hope, the echoes of harmony that could unite a divided community. And that, she realized, was the most important victory of all. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.